Welcome to this presentation on examining race and white privilege, an introduction, presented by Capital Diversity and Inclusion Consultants. I'm Dawn Gagno, the Director of Social Programming. Thank you for being with us. Today I will introduce you to the elements to be covered in this program, to myself and why I became an advocate, to how racism affects me as a white person. I will also define and discuss social justice and how it relates to equality and equity. I will then share some of the benefits our society has that are based on social justice and provide a reminder of what happens when there is no social justice. I will share quotes from the civil rights leaders I grew up with, and I will share an exercise with you to get you thinking about the next unit. You ready? Let's get started. All right, let's get started. This is a 4-unit presentation. In this, the first unit, I'm introducing you to what started my involvement in social justice, what social justice is and does, and a general overview of why social justice is imperative to the future of society. In Unit 2, we will discuss race and racism. We will define race, both biologically and socially. We will talk about the long struggle for freedom and equality, where it has succeeded, like emancipation and voting rights, and how it is still failing. In this unit, I will share some history and some remarkable black women in history. Then, in Unit 3, we will discuss what it means to be an anti-racist and an ally. I will share some examples of blatant privilege and racism. We will look to some role models and activists to gain insight and tips on how to be an ally in our daily life. And finally, in Unit 4, we will address white privilege. What is white privilege? Where can it be found? How does it affect society? I will discuss a couple instances of my own white privilege, where it has benefited me and where it has demanded a price. At the end of this unit, we will discuss how to use that privilege to raise awareness of it and to end the practice of it in our daily lives as we work towards a more equitable future for all people. I'd like to share with you a couple of moments in history from my childhood that shaped me into the social justice fighter I am today. In 1964, the Selma, Alabama Voting Rights March was intended to bring awareness to black voter suppression in the South. The bridge they marched across, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, was named after a Confederate leader and Ku Klux Klan Grand Dragon. They chose that bridge to make a statement and to protest the oppression of Negroes carried out and continued by the racist leadership in Alabama and across the southern states. They marched united but unarmed into a sea of waiting violence. It was the violence carried out by the white police force that made the biggest impact on America. The peaceful protest was met with unbridled violence and showed America's racism to the world. I was 5 years old when I saw and heard this. It was the worst violence most of us had ever witnessed. After 55 years, it still brings me to tears. This is why I began my fight against racism. The older I got, the more I knew I needed to find ways to end this injustice. I enrolled in college because I needed the power to fight back, and I earned that power through my education, my experience, and my advocacy. I started college late in life, and it was so hard at times that I considered quitting, but my grandchildren were watching, and I had to set a better example. It took years of hard work, but now I'm a graduate of McGeorge School of Law in Sacramento, where I earned a master's degree in public administration. I also hold a bachelor's degree in political science with a minor in education from UC Davis and associate's degrees in political science, social science, and legal studies from American River College. Because of all my experiences, I wanted to teach about the history of unrest and division in our nation, about how each moment of progress comes from civil action, but I didn't want to do it as a history teacher. This goes much deeper than just history. It is endemic to the institutions of this country, and to talk about that, I knew I needed to learn more. The learning process is ongoing, and the more I learn, the more I realize I still must learn. I want to share some of that journey with you. It has always been my intention to teach about social justice, or as John Lewis would say, let's get some good trouble to raise awareness levels of those around me, and hopefully to influence a more peaceful way forward. My white privilege has allowed me to get the education, and now I'm using both my education and my privilege to end white privilege. Racism is the severe, costly, and lethal rationalization of the denial of human equality and dignity of all persons, from the Global Campaign for Peace. It is also the pervasive, deep-rooted, and long-standing exploitation, control, and violence directed specifically at people of color. White privilege is an unearned benefit coming from nothing more than being born into white skin. It is a privilege unrecognized by most of those who have it, and is not something they are willing to give up out of fear of losing the silent benefits they receive. I see racism and white privilege as being intertwined. They feed off of one another to the detriment of all. Racism has always felt wrong to me. Today, it feels even worse because I understand it more and because it affects my daily life in ways I could not even imagine as a child. This violence, this fear, this stoking of racism, it must stop. I have had to reassess our world through the eyes of children and consider what we are leaving them. I've come face to face with stark realities facing children of color because my own family is multiracial. I shudder to think of the lessons that they are taking away from social media and alternative programming. It is time for me to put my advocacy to work once again. So here I am, because I want racial divides to truly become a thing of the past. Race should never determine who a person is unless we allow it to. Take a look at this picture. Can you tell me who will be successful just by looking at it? Can you tell me who will have more opportunity for success? If you say no, you should recognize that as your own privilege. All of them may achieve success, but 3 out of 4 of them will have to work harder and prove more, and one of them will have to do twice as much as the others for the same recognition. Can you tell by looking at this photo who has developmental disabilities? Because that will also play a factor in their future. The cycle of white power. White supremacy is supported by white privilege, which is supported by white supremacy. The Global Campaign for Peace has this to say about racial justice. The structural and institutional injustices of white supremacy are primarily manifested and maintained through white privilege. Unless and until white Americans honestly confront and acknowledge the advantages conferred by nothing more than being born into white skin, and accept the personal challenge and social challenge in eliminating that privilege, there can be no authentic reconciliation and social cooperation among all Americans. I'm going to show you a very graphic photo that exemplifies this statement. It shows Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin kneeling on the throat of George Floyd. It very clearly shows institutional racism and white privilege. How do I know this just from the photo? Because this cop had his hands in his pockets, carrying on a conversation with his fellow officers with zero regard for the life of the man under his control. White privilege and power. And because not only did no one stop him, when bystanders did try to intervene, his fellow officers prevented them from doing so. Institutional racism and power. By the time medics arrived and made him remove his knee, it was too late. Mr. Floyd could not be saved. Why had they stopped Mr. Floyd to begin with? Because they suspected that he had passed a fake $20 bill. The bill he used was real. This man was killed for $20. He was compliant and unarmed. He did argue that he had done nothing wrong and that they had no business treating him like he was a criminal. These officers jointly restrained him and put him on the ground. After he was restrained and no longer presented any type of threat, this officer knelt on his neck, refusing to move, even when Mr. Floyd begged for his life and told them he could not breathe. The only reason this man died is because that officer exercised his privilege over the life of a black man in his city. The officer was subsequently fired the following day and is facing second-degree murder charges, but he's out on a reduced bail. So let's talk for a minute about equality, equity, and justice. Social justice provides and promotes fairness and equity across all aspects of our lives. The National Education Association shares their definition. Social justice is a concept of fair and just relations between the individual and society. This is measured by the explicit and tacit terms for the distribution of wealth, opportunity for personal activity, and social privileges. Social justice is the difference between equality, equity, and justice. When the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, the intent was to create a sense of equality between the races. Since it was passed, nearly 60 years ago, we have had to fine-tune it to include marginalized groups not specifically mentioned in the original, because all men are created equal simply wasn't enough. Equality meant that everyone got a box to stand on so they could see the game, but it didn't work out that way. Equality was not recognized. Next, we decided that equity would be better than equality, because sometimes equal access does not mean equal outcomes. Just because you have what everyone else has does not mean that you have what you need. Now, everyone can see over the fence, but it still wasn't justice. There were still obstacles to overcome by some. 2 of these still need boxes to stand on, while 1 didn't. The only way to create a socially just environment is to remove the barriers that prevented them from seeing the game. By altering the nature of the barrier to remove the visual obstacle, justice was finally achieved. Social justice removes barriers and creates an environment where the supports are no longer necessary. Let's talk for a minute about what social justice is and the benefits we've earned from it. Social justice incorporates our ideas, morals, beliefs, values, and cultures into our society. This is where our laws are created and enforced. Social justice is mutable and changes as society's needs change. Social justice leads to less reason for differences and to an ability to accept and value others and their ideas, as well as our own. Social justice fights against perceived injustices. America was founded and built on the idea of equality for all and on the values of stability, general welfare and prosperity, and the idea that we all have the right to the pursuit of our own happiness. These rights, stated in the preamble to the Constitution, are continually updated to reflect our growing sense of equity and fairness. Our very first fight for social justice was our fight for independence and freedom from the tyranny of a foreign monarch. Since then, it has been an uphill battle. Now that we understand what social justice is, let's look at some of the ways social justice has benefited our society. In 1862, The Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery. In 1875, the Civil Rights Act, which has been updated numerous times since, includes fringe groups that have been left out of the previous versions. What started as strictly race now includes gender, religion, national origin, as well as gender identity and immigration status. This period of history, from 1865 through roughly 1930, saw the creation of the Ku Klux Klan and was the beginning of Jim Crow era restrictions and segregation that lasted for decades. 1920, the 19th Amendment gave us women's right to vote, 50 years after freed male slaves were granted that right. In 1948, desegregation began when President Truman ended segregation in the military, making it easier for blacks, whites, and immigrants to work together on behalf of America. In 1963, John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act, designed to end discriminatory wage practices, but was ineffective due to a lack of enforcement. In 1964, the Equal Employment Act was created to end gender and race discrimination in hiring practices and was part of the new Civil Rights Amendment. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act ended Jim Crow discriminatory practices, or so we thought. In 1965, women's reproductive rights were also a thing. It allowed women access to birth control with permission from their husbands. Later, it was updated to include single women and remove the requirement for a husband's permission, and in 1973, it included access to safe and legal abortion. In 2015, it also included access to the pill or birth control by all health insurance companies receiving federal subsidies. In 1967, the Marriage Equality Act legalized interracial marriages and validated biracial children. In 1968, the Americans with Disabilities Act was introduced. While it didn't become law until 1991, it focused on employment, education, and transportation. Since then, it also includes housing and health care. In 1994, the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, was introduced by Senator Joe Biden, signed into law by President Bill Clinton, and was meant to protect women from domestic violence and to create harsher penalties for the abuser. Unfortunately, this must be authorized regularly. In 2015, the Marriage Equality Act was amended to include same-sex marriage, now recognized in all 50 states. Most of these acts were not popular at the time they were enacted, but were necessary in response to citizen outcry. The people wanted the change, whether the legislators did or not. Each of these changes came only after the public protested for change. Imagine, if you can, a world in which social justice is completely missing. This is easier to do than it should be, as was just proven when armed insurrectionists attempted to take over the Hall of Congress to prevent Congress from doing their job of affirming Joe Biden as the 46th president. This coup attempt was possible because a single person without any sense of justice, social or otherwise, repeatedly lied to the public and enticed others to do the same, inciting them to violence on his behalf. He refused to conform to U.S. ethics, laws, and customs because they did not reaffirm his desire to maintain control. White supremacists and nationalists tried to subvert our election results by lies, corruption, and finally with violence. This happened because we had a leader with no moral compass and not a care in the world for anything but retaining his own white privilege and power. He did not care about the civil unrest or social dysfunction he created. Instead, after inciting it, he ran away and hid in his bunker watching it on television while tweeting about how great his people were doing and egging them on to greater violence. Many countries around the globe have little to no social justice. Girls can't go to school, Women can't choose whom to marry, can't drive, and can't vote. And some can't even work without permission from their husbands. Oppression and violence are normal in daily life. Social justice prevents social injustice. Socially just policies affect all classes and ethnicities, all races, and all genders. Without socially just policies, we are at the mercy of the powerful and of the silent who refuse to oppose them. Without social justice, we live in fear and uncertainty if we are not the ruling class. Yesterday's civil rights leaders gave us the tools and showed us the way forward. These lessons must be remembered and valued. We must once again listen to their words and live accordingly. Although said in different ways, the message is the same. We must put aside our own discomfort and do what is right. Silence is complicity. Malcolm X told us, if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. John Lewis told us sometimes you have to get in the way. You have to make some noise by speaking up and speaking out against injustice and inaction. That was his good trouble. Martin Luther King told us there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but he must take it because conscience tells him it is right. And Maya Angelou reminds us to develop enough courage so that you can stand up for yourself and then stand up for somebody else. Before we end this unit, let's take some time to consider. Think about your daily life and the encounters you might have with the world around you. Identify at least 3 aspects of life that can be affected by racism in each of the following categories: personal, economic, and cultural. All right. Our categories are personal, economic, and cultural. The basic things that I have identified in each of these categories, although they are far from the only ones, are impersonal, family, friends, neighbors, social media, and social organizations such as clubs, churches, and charities. Economically, jobs, education, housing, opportunities, employment, security, including safety, policing, and criminal justice. And culturally, history, museums, monuments, music, arts, theater, retail, traditions, and religious practices. I hope this gives you some food for thought as we prepare for our next unit. Thank you for your participation, and I look forward to our next unit on race and racism. Please take some time to process these ideas, and please share your thoughts or comments with me at dgagnoncdic@gmail.com. Please use Racial Justice Unit 1 feedback in the subject line. Thank you. I look forward to hearing from you and to seeing you at our next presentation.